Good evening. Welcome to tonight's live stream. I'm going to get started in a minute. I just need to let everybody know that the stream is going on social media platforms. Okay, I'm about to get started in a minute. And before I get started with tonight's show, I'm going to go into some perfunctory. And I'm going to talk about the first comic I produced as related to a print comic, John Haynes at Death's Store. And you can get John Haynes at Death's Store at Lulu right now. And you can get this book, which was my 2022 Kickstarter book, by clicking the link in the chat. So if you want to try out my first full comic that I did with artist Antonio Balderi and letterer Johns, you can get John Haynes at Death's Store on Lulu right now. So that's the first part of the perfunctory as related to SJS Direct products. And I'm going to talk more about the 2023 SJS Direct books, which are John Haynes Godbreaker, which came out in March. And you can also get the John Haynes 1987, which is going to be officially launched on May 26th. So you definitely want to pick up both of these books on Amazon in paperback right now. And you can pre-order John Haynes 1987 in Kindle right now. You can also pick up the 2022 books, which are ISIS Legacy and Eastern Horror. You can get both of these books on Amazon.com right now in paperback and Kindle format right now. And ISIS Legacy is currently available on Kindle Unlimited. So if you want to try out one of the SJS Direct books, you can try it out right now. So Kindle Unlimited, you can read it for free. So tonight's topic, I'm going to be talking about what's wrong with superhero comics. And as someone who has been reading and collecting comics ever since he was 4 years old, I'm just deeply saddened at the state of superhero comics. Now, superhero comics are the backbone of the comic book business, and superhero comics are how most comic book stores basically stay alive. It is superhero comics that are the most sold as related to the medium, but these days, superhero comics are in a sad state of affairs. And because superhero comics are in a sad state of affairs, they just are not anything that anybody wants to read. Now, what's really sad about superhero comics is that we are in the middle of a golden age as related to superheroes in media like television and film. And while superheroes in television and film are going out here and making billions of dollars, at the box office and doing fairly well in the ratings on networks like the CW back in the day. The superhero comics were never able to capitalize on that momentum. And that is the whole saddest thing about superhero comics. The entire industry has missed out on an opportunity to go out here and make a boom of sales the way it did back in 1989 when I was in high school, when Tim Burton's Batman first came out. Because when Tim Burton's Batman first came out, DC Comics was in a very good place as related to its editorial under the leadership of Jeanette Kahn. And because DC was in a good place as related to its editorial, DC Comics was able to synergize as related to its comics. And as it was able to synergize with its comics, they were able to go out here and make a lot of sales and get a lot of readers into Batman comics. So with Batman 89, they went out here and were able to make lots of money as related to DC Comics because the product was in a good place. But sadly, superhero comics have not been in a good place, and they haven't really been in a good place, I'd say, for the last 30 plus years. And I say 30 plus years because the problems that we have with superhero comics today are the result of I believe, 3 to 5 things. The first thing that I believe is a problem with superhero comics is that we don't have good editorial. Now, editorial is the institution that allows comic companies to have a vision and allows them to have a synergized line of products. And editorial at both Marvel and DC have suffered because they did not go out here and pick qualified individuals to go out here and be the leaders as related to both publishing houses. And because they did not pick qualified people, both companies were not able to go out here and can produce consistent lines of comics. Now, back in the 80s and the early 90s, Marvel Comics and DC Comics had really strong editorial. Over at Marvel Comics, they had Jim Shooter, who was the editor-in-chief over at Marvel Comics. And as the editor-in-chief at Marvel Comics, he was able to go out here and have a strong vision for Marvel Comics. And he was able to make sure that every comic that was published went out here and was able to synergize with each comic, and every comic was able to flow within each comic to create a consistent universe. Now, over at DC, the second company that produces the most superhero comics, Jeanette Kahn was doing a great job of rebuilding DC Comics as related to the Crisis of Infinite Earths. Now, DC in the early 80s was struggling for a time, but under Jeanette Kahn's leadership, DC Comics was able to get its footing and was able to become stable once more. And with DC and Marvel both being stable at the part of the late 80s and early 90s, both companies were able to grow. And as both companies were able to grow, they were able to go out here and produce consistent product. And again, the consistent product made superhero comics a lot of fun, made a lot of the books easily accessible, and made a lot of the books easy to follow. And that was all due to the editorial having a strong vision. And again, the editorial creating high standards, and the editorial going out here and making sure that all of the talent was able to work together. And if you don't have good leadership setting a tone and a direction, you're going to get what we get right now as related to the state of affairs of superhero comics. Now, superhero comics have not only suffered because of poor editorial, they have also suffered because there was a problem with a lot of the talent. Now, one of the problems I saw with a lot of the talent as related to comics is they really were not honed in their craft. These are problems that were hairline fractures that started in the 90s. We had problems with editorial, and even worse, we had a lot of artists like Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, and Todd McFarlane, who were superstar artists, but they really were not staying to house standards, and that really hurt the craft. Now, they wanted to go out here and just create their own distinct style, and as they were creating their own distinct style, yes, they did make a lot of popular comics, but the craft really suffered because we lost editorial when Jim Shooter was fired from Marvel in 1987, and we also had problems with DC as related to its editorial much later on. And again, editorial is very important as related to artists because editorial is the one who goes out here and lets people know that they have to stay on model with character designs. They let them know that the character's mission has to be maintained, and they are the ones who keep the storylines at consistent as related to things. And if you don't have a good, strong foundation as related to editorial, you're not going to be able to go out here and be able to produce comics consistently. And this was a big problem at the big two, Marvel and DC Comics. Editorial really wasn't doing a good job of going out here and maintaining consistency. And because they did not maintain consistency, what happened was the quality really started to drop. Now, the quality at Marvel in the 90s, yes, they were making a lot of sales, but a lot of the storytelling really suffered because at that time we had a lot of the editors without a strong hand like Jim Shooter to give them guidance. What happened was you had people who were just going out here and making these gimmick stories that were filled with plot devices, and it was all about shocking and awing people. And as they tried to shock and awe people, what happened was most of the readers started to look at these stories and started to get turned off by these stories because instead of going out here and crafting action and adventure, that was a lot of fun. What we got were a lot of convoluted storylines that were just gimmick based. And again, gimmick based because the editorial wanted to go out here and get the big sales, but not really focus on the quality at Marvel Comics. Now, Marvel Comics was making a lot of money, but they really weren't working on developing craft. And after the loss of Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, and Todd McFarlane, instead of focusing on craft, what they focused was on gimmicks. And as their editorial house did not have a good direction under Jim Shooter, the editor at the time, Tom DeFalco, was a good guy, but he just really didn't know how to keep the house of Marvel and the house of ideas in order. And what happened was they decided to go in a new editorial direction where a group of editors would work on the X-Men, a group of ones would work on Marvel Heroes, and a group would work on Spider-Man books, and a group would work on these rebel characters like Wolverine, anti-hero characters. And this really didn't help Marvel as related to its creativity. No, it really did a lot of damage to its continuity as related to superhero comics, and their superhero comics quality really started to decline. Now, it started to decline around 94, late 94, 95, and this was right around the time Marvel had gotten its own stock, and they decided to go out here and buy Heroes World. And as they were buying Heroes World, they were thinking about getting into distribution. And as they were looking to get into distribution, they didn't look at the quality of their products. And the quality of their products, basically on the Marvel Hero side, had fallen off dramatically. For many of their titles, the storytelling basically just fell completely off. I remember in 94, 95, a lot of the comics started to really get bad. I mean, that's when Marvel wanted to try to compete with Image. And as they tried to compete with Image, they went extreme with their designs. They went out here and made all of the characters try to look more like the Wildcats characters that Jim Lee created. And these extreme designs, they were just extremely over the top. And they had basically turned off readers along with the crazy storylines. And several of those crazy storylines basically alienated a lot of viewers. These storylines included the Clone Saga by, I believe his name was Howard Mackey. The Crossing, which was a storyline that where Iron Man was said to be a pawn of Kang, and they made Tony Stark into a bad guy, hoping to replace him with a teenage version trying to copy what happened in the pages of Green Lantern with Hal Jordan and Kyle Rayner. Then we had storylines like I Married a Skrull, which came, I think, about 93 or so. And all of these storylines and had derailed most of Marvel's heroes. And as these storylines basically derailed most of Marvel's heroes, they did extensive damage to the brand, which led to a major decline in sales as related to readers. And this couldn't come at a worse time. And that what came was the complete collapse of the whole Heroes World deal. Now, the Heroes World deal, Marvel was looking to go into distribution, but Marvel really didn't understand how distribution worked. Now, distribution used to work like this. Company, you would go out here and you would ship books to people, and what happened was if the books sold, the company that you sold, the people you sold it to with the distributors got a cut, and they got a cut of the profits, you got a cut of the profits, and the unsold comics just basically were sent back to the publisher. However, what happened with Heroes World was the stories were so bad that so many books were starting to get sent back. This combined with overprinting, what this did was it went out here and led to Marvel taking huge losses. And these huge losses basically led to the bankruptcy of the corporate Marvel. And this bankruptcy did a lot of damage to Marvel. And it just was a major controversy. Now, DC was maintaining its consistency. And I say it was in a second golden age. And it was DC that basically was holding up the whole superhero genre along with Image. And they managed to hold things together for a while. But with sales starting to drop, so people were dropping superhero comics. And they were dropping superhero comics because the quality had made a major drop from the days of the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s as related to quality. I mean, there wasn't a consistent block of books from in the catalog that readers could go out here and enjoy. And because readers couldn't go out here and enjoy a consistent block of books, what happened was, again, sales started to drop. And as sales started to drop, and Marvel and DC were out here just struggling overall, because if people didn't like Marvel, some of them, they didn't go buy comics anymore. And the DC fans, they were trying to hold things up, and the Image fans, but the whole thing was you need all of these superhero comics companies to remain strong in order to support the comic shops all across the country. If there's nobody in creating quality books at Marvel and DC, what happens is there's no way to support the comic shops, which got most of their sales from these two big companies. Now, Marvel managed to pull itself together in 1998 with Heroes Return. They managed to pull themselves together, and sales started to come back. And as sales started to come back, they started to do fairly well for a couple of years. Unfortunately, as things went on, Tom DeFalco stepped down as Marvel's editor-in-chief, and we got one of the worst editors-in-chief, Joe Quesada. Now, Joe Quesada and Dan Didio, who took over DC, they created what started to be the malaise era of superhero comics. And they created this malaise era of superhero comics because Joe Quesada at Marvel, he really didn't have a direction for where he wanted to take the company. And Dan Didio, he basically wanted to go out here and do these dark and dreary stories. And both men basically wanted to take superhero comics in a direction that was called the deconstructed story model. Now, the deconstructed story model has its roots in the late 1980s. It has its roots in books like Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller. These two comics basically are the ones that are considered to be defining books of the 80s. Now, I didn't read them until about 2020 or so, and I wasn't really impressed with either of them. But the whole thing is, many people like Joe Quesada and Dan Didio saw that dark deconstructed model as one that was they thought would remain popular, and they wanted to bring that dark deconstructed model to comics and make it mainstream as related to heroes. Unfortunately, what Dan Didio and Joe Quesada did not understand is that the deconstructed story model was a commentary on superheroes. It was not meant to be a model for telling stories as related to the superhero comic paradigm. What Alan Moore originally was planning with Watchmen was to make a commentary on what a superhero is not meant to be. He was making a commentary on how a superhero's ethics need to not be like people like politicians or corporate types. He was trying to make a commentary saying that this is not what a superhero is. Unfortunately, most people who grew up reading comics like Joe Quesada and many of the comic creators that came up in the 90s and the 2000s, they took the books like Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns to be gospel. And as they took Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns to be gospel, what they wanted to do was change the story model of superhero comics to this dark and dreary and depressing story model. And that dark and dreary the story model basically is the thing that turned off a lot of casual readers and a lot of longtime readers who had grown up with these characters. Now, with many Gen Xers, we grew up with these characters because we grew up in latchkey homes, and many of these characters we considered to be our friends. We considered them to be paragons of morals and virtue, and we considered them to be ideals of what it meant to be good. But because Dan Didio and Joe Quesada wanted to do darker characters and darker stories, what they wanted to do was go out here and change superheroes into these much darker and drearier characters, and they wanted to turn these characters into darker, drearier, angrier heroes, believing that applying a Watchmen model to both the Marvel and the DC universe would make heroes that are more relatable to readers. Unfortunately, it did not make heroes more relatable to readers, and it didn't make heroes relatable to readers because nobody wants to read stories about heroes who are just out here doing all sorts of dirt. No, when people read about superheroes, they want to read about a person who is standing up for what is good and what is right. That's what people wanted to read. Unfortunately, people weren't able to get those kinds of books. And as superhero comics went from a black and white medium with good guys who are good and bad guys who are bad, we started to enter into this gray area. And in that gray area, we started to see superheroes looking to compromise their ethics or going out here and acting just as bad as the bad guys. And as they acted as bad as the bad guys, sales continued to drop. And as sales continued to drop, what happened with superhero comics is we started to see this cycle of rebooting. Now, this cycle of rebooting basically started with, as I see it, the whole Heroes Reborn thing over at Marvel. And after Heroes Reborn wound up making a lot of controversy, we got the Heroes Return, which basically created a resurgence at Marvel. But as soon as editorial changed, a lot of the books just started to fall off. And as books started to fall off, what happened was we started to see books like Iron Man, which came out and had a great run by Kurt Busiek and Sean Chen, fall off because editorial did not know how to transition a creative team. And as we got to it, what they did was try to put inexperienced writers on Iron Man. Iron Man sales basically dropped like a rock because after the whole sentient armor storyline, the book just basically crashed in terms of quality. The same thing happened, sadly, when Dan Jurgens took over Captain America without any editorial to give him some guidance. He started doing storylines that turned off readers, And that basically led to the decline of the Captain America book. And the Avengers book started to fall off just as Kurt Busiek left the book towards issue 60, and Fantastic Four fell apart as well. Many of the Marvel books fell apart as related to the 98 reboot because editorial did not have a direction that they wanted to go in. Editorial really just didn't know how to transition from one creative team to the next. And this is what led to the decline of the Heroes Return era and led to the new Avengers era, which was started by Brian Michael Bendis. And since then, the books have again gone to this deconstructed story model, which is Bendis was known for. And that's what led to the start of the decline over at Marvel. And they had all of these dark and dreary heroes. And then over at DC, you had Dan Didio looking to take the heroes into a dark direction with Identity Crisis. Now, Identity Crisis and Graduation Day with the Teen Titans, both of these books were the thing that really changed superheroes over at DC. And this changed superheroes over at DC from bright, sunny characters who were filled with hope into these just very angry and dreary heroes, and created all sorts of ethical situations that made it where the heroes were looking to cross lines. And with Graduation Day, they showed Donna Troy getting killed, and the Young Justice kids were bright and fun, graduating to become dark, cynical heroes. And they also showed that in Identity Crisis, the heroes that we thought were ideals, they had compromised their ethics as related to the sexual violation of Sue Dibney, and they sought to sweep it under the rug. And that was completely out of character for those characters, and that was a major turnoff for a lot of readers. And again, this was the start of the decline of the superhero comic, and the decline of the superhero comic just continued to get worse because the big problem with superhero comics is, one, they are just not fun. Two, the heroes just don't act like heroes anymore. And three, we don't have any sort of quality control as related to stories, and we don't have any sort of quality control as related to art. It's these issues that make superhero comics a chore to read when you have books that just have heroes who you cannot relate to, heroes you cannot identify with, heroes who aren't living like you. What happens is you don't want to read their stories because nobody wants to read a story about a character who is doing the same dirt as the bad guys. And that is the big problem with superhero comics today. Superhero comics don't have heroes in them anymore. No, superhero comics basically have individuals who have these gray ethics, and it's these gray ethics that make these characters someone that people don't want to be like, because who would want to be like an individual who believes that they can just go out here and do all sorts of dirt? I mean, when I read superhero comics today, I don't see people who inspire people or give them hope. I see miserable people who look to make other people miserable. And yeah, that's something that would be interesting to read in a comic like Watchmen, but it's not something people want to read about as related to superhero comics. When it comes to mainstream superhero comics, people want to be inspired, people want to get hope, and they want to get three things, and I've talked about this before. They want to get a laugh as related to the humor. They want to see a fun action and adventure. And the third thing that they want to see is a solution similar to their lives that they can apply. Those are the three things people want to see in a comic, but we don't get to see that in modern superhero comics, where the characters are just extremely selfish, extremely greedy, extremely narcissistic. We don't get to see a person that we can go out here and say, I want to be like. No, we get to see degenerate characters who are lowlifes, and that's not something you want to see a character like Superman or Batman represent. No, when it comes to superheroes, people want to see hope and inspiration, not heroes who go out here and do unethical things. That's the same thing that they get to see with their boss at the corporate office, or they get to see in the street with the weed man, or the kind of crimes that they hear politicians participate in on the 6 o'clock news. That's what we're getting inside of today's superhero comics. And these superheroes, they are not showing us how they are the heroes. That is a major problem with superhero comics, in that we don't get to see heroes who are clear heroes. Now, back in the 80s, when you had books like The New Teen Titans, or books in the 70s like Luke Cage, you got to see a clear picture of a hero. I mean, look at this Luke Cage cover. You clearly see Luke Cage is a hero. He's standing up to fight for his name against the evil Eric Jostin, Power Man. And again, this is a book that shows you good guys and bad guys, and shows you good guys going out here and standing up to the bad guy. That's what people want to see. And again, they want pictures of clear heroes, because clear heroes give you somebody you can relate to, somebody you can identify with, somebody you can go out here and say, I want to be like. But with today's modern heroes, they aren't people you want to be like. And things have gotten worse since the days of the compromised ethics of the 90s. And in the 2000s, in the 2010s, we started to see the heroes basically being turned into dysfunctional people. I mean, I have seen the rise of what I call the beta male hero. And this beta male hero has no redeeming qualities and is basically a pathetic individual. Now, I've sat there and I've read recent issues of Spider-Man, and I was just so sad to read this. I mean, today's modern Spider-Man is nothing like the happy-go-lucky Peter Parker, who, while he had streaks of bad luck, still had some hope and still wanted to go out here and honor the memory of his Uncle Ben by using his power responsibly. Instead of us getting a man who has great power and wants to use it responsibly, we've got a sad, pathetic beta male who is wallowing in self-pity, and he's so pathetic that he's sitting there working for his enemy, Norman Osborn. His girl, Mary Jane, has divorced him and now decided to go out here and get with another man in an alternate universe. I mean, why would I spend $5 to go read this? That's the critical question I would like to ask people at Marvel. Why would somebody want to spend $5 to watch a guy be miserable when comic books are supposed to be an escape? When it comes to comics, comics are supposed to be an escape from our lives. We're supposed to see people who we want to aspire to be like. We're supposed to see people who we want to see have some of the successes we have, and possibly see a road to getting that success ourselves. That's what good comic book storytelling is all about. It's all about just letting you escape to a world, seeing a hero going out here and dealing with problems like yours, and seeing that hero overcome those problems in both their personal and superhero lives. That's what superhero comics are all about. But instead of that, what we're getting are these long, meandering stories that are filled with guys who are just wallowing in self-pity. I mean, I recently read a Chip Zdarsky Batman comic that just made me shake my head. I mean, his Batman is stuck in an alternate universe, and he's sitting there being miserable. And that book was a chore to get through. I mean, he's in an alternate universe. He's sitting up there miserable. The whole book was so miserable that I just absolutely just disgusted by it. And I read a Daredevil where he's no longer working in Hell's Kitchen towards protecting the people of Hell's Kitchen. No, he's somewhere far away in some Shaolin land, married to Elektra, and he's out here just trying to build some sort of civilization or do something. I'm like, this is not who Daredevil is, and that's another big problem. And again, relates to editorial. It really relates to editorial because they don't know how to set a course for their characters, don't know how to set a vision for where they want to go with their characters, and they don't go out here and check creators and let them know, hey, you're not going to take this character off their mission. This is who this character is. This is what this character represents. And many of these books, they're just so far removed from what they used to be that I look at them, and I look at many of the books, the older books in my collection that are like 30, 35, 40 years old, and even some of them that are 50 years old. And I go, this feels like a completely different character. I mean, yes, I know characters change and evolve over time, but these characters don't even feel or sound the same. I mean, I look at the stories that are presented in 2023 of many of these characters, and they don't look or feel the same. The values, the morals, the ideals that made that character who they are, they're just not there anymore. And that's a major problem as related to superhero comics, because the big problem, as I see it, is that the hero is gone from superhero comics. Yes, we've got people with superpowers, but those people are not people we can relate to. And that's the other big problem with superhero comics that I see, is that we've lost focus on people. I mean, that's a major problem for me, as when I'm reading some of these comics, I'm not seeing people, and I'm not seeing people we can relate to. I mean, if this is who people are today, then I have to say that this is a very sad reflection of who we are. I mean, when I read the Iron Man book by Jerry Duggar, I mean, I see a pathetic beta male. When I read Chip Zdarsky's Batman, I see another pathetic beta male. When I see the Chip Zdarsky Daredevil, I just see another pathetic man. And when I read the Spider-Man books, I see a wimp who Peter Parker grew out of. I mean, I just see a whole bunch of pathetic people that I wouldn't want to spend time with. And if somebody doesn't want to spend time with you, they're not going to want to spend money on your stories. I mean, this is just, it's sad to watch, and it's just disappointing to take a look at. Hey, Supremo, glad to see you here. Storylines that I have enjoyed recently. I mean, there was The Flash I enjoyed by Jeremy Adams. He did a fantastic job on The Flash. And there's Nightwing by Tom Taylor. He does a great job of giving us that hope and fun over on Nightwing. There's the Moon Knight book by, I think his name is Zeb, something like that. But he does a great job of giving us that hope. Even with a dark character like Moon Knight, he gives us a fun book. And Ghost Rider, it's been a really solid book. But the big problem is that there's a problem with the with editorial not keeping the books consistent. What's going on, Mr. Rainbow? How are you? Holy Knight Vader 999. Today's modern heroes do feel like villains, and they're just not fun. Rob IS, he says, does this sort of create an anti-hero? Wolverine used to be an anti-hero, but we don't have anti-heroes. We have basically villains. And One Full Boss, you make a good point. Peter Parker just seems so angry. I mean, I miss the hopeful Peter Parker of the 70s and the 80s. And the people like Joe Quesada didn't like that Peter Parker who was growing up to become a man. But I'd rather have that man rather than this man in crisis who's sitting around angry all the time. I mean, this is just an angry guy I would want nothing to do with. I mean, he's not a guy that you would say, hey, I want to be like, or he's kind of cool, or he's kind of fun. I mean, if you guys really want to get a good Spider-Man, go look at the Ross Andru and Jerry Conway Spider-Mans of the 70s. That's a hopeful, fun guy. That's a guy you would really enjoy. And again, he was out here. He was a hero. And while he had his problems, he knew how to navigate through his emotions because he had Uncle Ben to teach him how to be a man. And he had family and stuff to help him through those times as related to being a hero. Forrest McLeod asks, how would I write Blade? Well, if you read my book, Eternal Night, this is how I would write Blade. I would want to make it a horror and action movie. And I would want it to be a horror and action movie that was, about him taking on these vampires, and maybe possibly find a way to have him take on somebody like Dracula to kind of make it fresh, or try to go out here and have some sort of connection to the demons that vampires, and I would put some stuff in there like I did in Eternal Night, talking about how the vampire is a form of a demon, and put that type of lore in there. That's what I would try to do with a Blade. And again, Blade, I look at Wesley Snipes' Blade, and I would be trying to take some things from there and add some things of my own, because Blade is a good character and he has a great story, and Wesley Snipes took him to another level. But Marvel, over the couple of years as they put him in the comics, have basically turned him into a caricature of himself. And there wouldn't be anything about daughters or anything like that. It would just be straight action and adventure. And that's what I would want to have in Blade. And if you want to really check out what I would want with Blade, you can check out my novel Eternal Night. And Eternal Night will let you know, how I write vampires and vampire lore. So you can read Eternal Night on Kindle Unlimited. If you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read it for free. And Eternal Night is one of my takes on vampires. I mean, I did some in the Isis and Isis series as well, with Bride of Dracula, Night of the Vampires, and Escape from Transylvania. But I would want to make it, while it's dark, still have some moments of humor, because horror movies are supposed to have humor, and give us a good mix of action and adventure. So that's what I would want with Blade. And I believe the superhero comic version of Blade, he stopped being fun. And again, this is a big problem with superhero comics. We have so much focus on these guys and how miserable they are that they don't even have time to take on the bad guys. This is another problem I have with superhero comics. And we have a problem with writers who don't know how to write villains. And when you don't know how to write villains, this really impedes the whole comic book story model, because it's bad guys that drive the story's conflict, and it's bad guys that make us care about the hero. This is something that I understood when I was writing the book John Haynes at Death's Door. I understood that Thanatos, the villain here, had to drive the story. As the heel, he had to go out here and be the threat that John Haynes had to overcome. And he had to overcome him in the 32 pages that I wrote in this book. And again, that's what you want to do when you're doing comics. But I don't see that good balance as related to comics. I don't see the balance, because there's supposed to be 3 parts of a comic book story. We have Secret Identities story, we have the hero story, and then we have the villain story. And we don't get to see those 3 elements in the 3-act paradigm, because all these guys sit there and do is sit up and have these characters mope and be somber and talk about how bad their lives are. Well, if I wanted to see somebody talking about how bad their lives are, I can go to YouTube and I can listen to some of these comic book YouTubers, and I can listen to them complain for free. When you're trying to sell a product, you want to go out here and give people a reason to get excited. You want to give them a reason to anticipate picking up the next book. You want to get people to the point where they're looking forward to meeting with this character and them being a friend that they want to spend time with. But with these new modern superhero comics, these are not people you want to spend time with outside of maybe Wally West Flash or Dick Grayson's Nightwing. And you can't run a publishing house like that. No, you need all of the characters to be relatable. You need all of the characters to be somebody that people want to spend time with. Because if all of the characters aren't people you want to spend time with, you're not going to want to go out here and spend money on these books. And that's something that Marvel's editorial really, and DC's editorial really don't think about. They're not really thinking about this, because many at big conglomerates like Disney and Warner Brothers Discovery, they're just here thinking, oh, we've got these IPs. All we're thinking about is adapting the IPs and making some money. That's all they're thinking about, is adapting the material so they can make monies off movies and TV. And because all they think about is making money off movies and TV, they're not really thinking about the quality of their books. And they really don't understand the connection of their superhero comics to their merchandising and their licensing and their adaptations of film and television. If you don't have the stories from the comics that are quality, then there's no way for you to go out here and adapt any material. And that's something that Kevin Feige is running into right now, because he's basically run out of classic Marvel material to go out here and produce and adapt, because with Avengers Endgame, he ran out of classic Marvel material. And now that he's run out of classic Marvel material, he's trying to adapt these concepts from all new, all different Marvel. And as he tries to adapt concepts from all new, all different Marvel and many of the modern comics, he's finding himself in a rut, because this material is just not high quality. The writers spent more time focusing on creating these mopey and depressing characters, and they didn't really focus on developing bad guys to drive conflict. So many of the stories that they produce are extremely uneven, and many of the material that they produce is uneven because the source material it comes from is extremely uneven, and many of it's missing a lot of things as related to plot points. It's missing a lot of things as related to character development. There are a lot of serious issues with a lot of the newer characters, like Kamala Khan's Ms. Marvel, or even in the hands of a very inept creator, you can take a character like She-Hulk and ruin them. And again, when you don't have a good foundation in editorial, this is what you wind up publishing. In order to have quality books, you need to have quality editorial. And the people working at Marvel are a pale shadow of what Jim Shooter used to be. I mean, Jim Shooter was a man who made sure that all the books were consistent, and Jeanette Kahn and her editorial team over at DC made sure that all of the books were consistent so that the reader got the same experience with each book. So when a person came in and into one DC book or another, or a Marvel book, back in the late 80s when I used to collect comics, they would walk in and you could go in and pick up a lower tier title and get the same experience you would get with a higher tier title. A popular book like X-Men would have the same reading experience as a third tier book at the time, like Iron Man or Captain America, and you would have the same reading experience, and that just showed the experience of editorial. That's what I do right now with SJS Direct. I mean, you get the same experience from a ISIS legacy that you would get from an Eastern horror of the Hyena Woman, or a John Hayes Godbreaker, or John Hayes 1987. All the books have the same reading experience so that you can come into each book and every book can be an entry point. And that's something that really lacks over at Marvel and DC right now. What really lacks is that editorial cannot go out here and make books consistently. Yes, you will have a couple of good books here and there. You will have Moon Knight and Ghost Rider over well at Marvel. You will have Nightwing and Flash over at DC. But then you will have lots of books like flagship books like Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman that will struggle. And that brings down the overall company as related to superhero comics. Under a good editorial team, you would have a vision set by the editor-in-chief as related to direction for the titles. And as he sets the direction and the tone for the books, he goes out here, or she goes out here, and gives the guidance to the creators as related to the characters and their missions. And as they give guidance as related to the characters and their missions, they make sure that all of the characters are working together in a universe in a consistent fashion. And as they're working together in that consistent fashion, all of the books give you the same reading experience. And that's not something we're getting in superhero comics these days, where, again, you've got characters who are dreary and depressing. You've got a couple of bright books here and there. Nothing is consistent. Nothing is synergizing. And again, we live in a world that's just completely jumbled. And again, those universes that are jumbled, they don't get you consistent sales. And sadly, editorial doesn't understand how to connect the dots. If you don't have a consistent universe, you're not going to get consistent sales. You're not going to be able to get people to pick up other books. And really, nobody wants to pick up books with a bunch of losers. I mean, who wants to spend time with a bunch of losers who hate their lives, hate their jobs? I mean, if you want to do that, you can go to your cubicle if you're working in corporate America and find a couple of people like that. But people go to comics because they don't want to be around those kinds of people. No, they want to be around people who are living and enjoying life. Even though they've got obstacles, even though they've got problems, they're still finding a way to move on. And we're not getting that with modern comics because modern comics feature people who are not like us, or if they are like us, it's a sad reflection of our country. I mean, if they are like us, it's a sad reflection on us because art and literature, again, are a reflection of us. And if you've got superheroes who hate their lives and hate being a superhero, then why would I want to read that story? I mean, what is the point of going out here and putting on that costume to go out here and fight the bad guys? I mean, a lot of them, it's like they've lost their passion, and it's like they're doing things out of obligation. That's another problem with superhero comics that I see, that I talked about in another story that I did, and this was a goth fiction book, the Spinsterella trilogy. I mean, in Legendary Mad Matilda, Matilda's relationship with her boyfriend was obligatory, and it just felt really dead. Whereas her relationship with the Quiet Man in Spinsterella was something she wanted to do. And again, I don't see the passion from a lot of creators these days who are currently in comics, and that's what's reflected on the page in a lot of superhero books. A lot of people are here, they're just going through the motions. They're just writing for the sake of writing. And I believe comics matter. Your boy Zach talked about this, how some people coming in the comics, they're coming in not because they love superheroes and they love telling stories about superheroes. No, they're coming in because they've created this covert contract with Hollywood. And as they've created this covert contract with Hollywood, they believe if they go out here and write comics, this will lead to Hollywood executives noticing them. And as the Hollywood executives notice them, they believe this will lead to them getting either a Netflix deal or some sort of deal to write a screenplay. But as someone who has studied the entertainment industry for over 25 years, I can tell you that's not a gateway into Hollywood. Yes, comics get adapted. And again, they're adapted because the studios own the IPs. And this is not a gateway to you getting a job as related to screenwriting. No, what people don't understand is that comics were always the bottom of the whole entertainment medium as related to publishing. The top tier of publishing is writing nonfiction, like I do with The Man Crisis and the Stop Simpin books. The second tier is writing fiction, like I do with novels like Eternal Night and the Isis series, and especially things like women's fiction, like the Spinsterella trilogy and the Thetas. Though that's the second tier, and the lowest tier is comics. And comics are at the bottom as related to publishing. But you have a lot of people out here thinking, oh, if I do these comics, it's going to be a gateway to me going on to get a screenwriting deal. Well, I hate to break it to people that screenwriting is a completely different business. And usually if they're people coming to you, again, that's a whole different deal altogether. And they're not going to just pick up a guy who writes comics because, again, the person writing comics is doing it for a different reason. People who write comics because they love the characters. They have a passion for storytelling. They love writing these characters. They come into comics because they love comic books. They love superheroes, and they love those characters, and they want to see those characters shared with another generation. That's the reason why people come into superhero comics. They understand the world of superhero comics is low pay. They understand the world of superhero comics means a lot of work, but they do it because they love it. Again, it's a passion project for a lot of creators. And again, this is what's missing from superhero comics, where many of the editorial offices of places like Marvel and DC have become dreary, depressing places. And again, they've become dreary and depressing places because we have individuals who really don't want to be there, really don't love the characters, really don't love storytelling. I mean, we have people who want to be someplace else, and because they want to be someplace else, they are apathetic about the way they write superheroes. And this is why we got these dark and dreary versions of these characters, these dark reflections of these characters. We've got these dark reflections of these characters who are miserable because the people who create these materials are miserable themselves. They are what people call the SJWs, who hate their jobs because they want to go out here and use these characters not to tell stories that are true to them. What they want to do is go out here and be able to use these characters as avatars for whatever agenda they have, or they just want to go out here and collect a paycheck, and they want to go out here and just coast as related to this kind of job. Unfortunately, there is no coasting in publishing because, again, 90% of the books always fail. And with 90% of the books failing, there is no coasting. And again, this has really hurt the entire business of comics because, again, superhero comics are the backbone of the comic book business. And with superhero comics being the backbone of the comic book business, many of these creators, they want to go out here and make stories that they want, that they like, based on their feelings and the covert contract that they have. Unfortunately, that's hurting the entire business of comics because a lot of shops, they need these comics to sell in order for these comic shop owners to pay their rent. And sadly, what's happened is because superhero comics are a creative mess, what's happening is that many shop owners are the ones who are suffering. I mean, I remember during the time of All New, All Different Marvel, we lost hundreds of comic shops and because the content wasn't good. And again, in this internet age, content is king. And if your content isn't solid, then you're not going to be able to get customers to buy your product. And customers haven't had much incentive to buy superhero comics because they're dealing with dreary, depressing heroes, and they're dealing with a universe that isn't consistent. They're dealing with a universe where once they start to get comfortable with the character, the editorial yanks the rug right out from under them. And as editorial yanks the rug out from under them, what happens is everything that they were getting used to gets reset with a new #1 issue. And again, the new #1 issue, a lot of these editorials do is what they want to do is try to think that they can revive the entire industry with a new #1. But that gimmick went out in 1998 with Heroes Return. And with that gimmick going out in 98, it just isn't having the same impact. But many in editorial continue to do the same things and expect a different result. And that's the definition of insanity. However, this is the covert contract that many in editorial at Marvel and DC have. They believe that they are going to be able to revive the entire industry with one book, but that's never how it's been as related to publishing. No, one book isn't going to turn things around overnight. And I know this for a fact because I've published multiple books. And yes, I'll have a book like a John Haynes, A Conversation with Death, that will do well. But sometimes it takes years for the audience to discover other books. I mean, when I talk to readers online, they'll tell me that they found this book maybe 2-3 years later, like Wrath of the Cyber Goddess. I published that in 2014, and it never took off until a couple of years later. I mean, people don't discover books until much later, but you'll have people thinking that they're going to make the next giant-size X-Men #1 or the next X-Men '94, but it's hard to do that when you keep rebooting every couple of years. Just when you're getting into a story or a series of storylines, you get the entire series canceled and rebooted. And again, this is frustrating for a lot of customers of superhero comics. People want to get into the book, but they find out the book is canceled, and then they don't have an incentive to go out here and buy any more books because nothing is consistent. This is another problem with superhero comics. In addition to the dreary characters, the dreary story models, is the constant rebooting. The constant rebooting is frustrating for people, and it's frustrating because just when you're enjoying the book, just when you want to tell your friends about the book, just when you want to take your friends to the comic shop and show them the books, what happens is the book gets canceled, and that's something that hurts the sales at the comic shops. The comic shop is out here looking to try to build some momentum as related to these books and generating a pull list and generating consistent pull list sales, and everything just gets yanked out under the rug from them. And that's another big problem with superhero comics. I mean, superhero comics, you have people who really don't understand the publishing business. You have people in comics, again, that are just don't know how to do things as related to telling good stories. And you have, in some cases, you have artists on certain books that really don't know how to go out here and sequence a page. This is another big problem with superhero comics I've seen with a lot of books. I mean, I see artists that don't really know how to consistently frame a sequence. Meanwhile, when I go over to places like Comic Artists Seeking Commissions Facebook group, I do see people who do know how to do this, and those people should be working at Marvel and DC, but they go out here and hire these other people because they're their friends, and sadly, we see poor quality on the page. And if people see poor quality on the page, they have, again, no incentive to buy a book about a depressing, dreary character who takes 12 pages to tell us what the book is about. That's a major turnoff as related to the craft of comics today. Again, no craft being taught because anybody who knows their craft knows you have to tell your story in the first 3 to 5 pages, because when people go to a comic shop to pick up a comic, they want to go out here and read the first 3 to 5 pages. And if they don't see anything going on in the first 3 to 5 pages, they are going to put the book on the rack. And that's a lesson that editorial is not teaching to writers and artists. That's a basic lesson that nobody is teaching, but I teach it. And again, this is one of the problems with superhero comics. Again, no real teaching of craft, no real teaching of the techniques of comics. I mean, that's why the medium is suffering right now as related to superhero comics. Nobody's teaching craft. We have a lot of people who are in comics but don't really have a love for it to understand the craft of it, because like screenwriting, comic book writing is a craft, and you have to learn working at the side of people, and that's something that you have to learn because, again, comics are a team process, and that's something I learned when I was doing No Good Deed with Bill Walko and doing John Haynes at Death's Door with Antonio Balderi. It's a team process. And again, superhero comics today, we really don't see people learning how to work as a team. We don't see them learning craft from a seasoned editor, because they just hire some woman and she'll work for $37,000 a year, when you really need to hire a professional who you pay 6 figures to, because when you have a craft, you want to get somebody who knows their craft. I mean, when I look at a comic book writer or a comic book artist, it's almost the same as going out here and hiring an electrician or a plumber. You're hiring somebody who has a specific skill set, and that specific skill set has value, because when you have specific skills as related to things, you know how to make something work. You know how to put things together. This is a set of skills, and again, a set of skills is something that you learn hands-on. And again, in the comic book business, we have a big problem with superhero comics, because in the 90s, when we had Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, and Todd McFarlane as superstars, the whole structure of teaching the craft basically fell completely off, because people were caught up in their celebrity. And as creators got caught up in their celebrity, what happened was we started to lose craft and technique. And craft and technique are very important to superhero comics, because in order to make good superhero comics, you have to learn what the craft of comic books are. And this is something that is being lost, as I'm seeing right now, because we've lost a lot of legendary comic book artists like George Perez, Neil Adams, and we've lost many other artists over the last couple of years. And with their passing, we lost a lot of craft. And again, this is going to impact superhero comics because when you go to these cons, these artists not only give you commissions, when they talk to other artists, this is how you network and you learn different things that's related to technique, and you learn things about how to make a page strong. When you talk to a writer, they can tell you how to set up your sequences as related to your panels so that they can transition from page to panel and page to page. And again, this is craft that is taught, and this is craft that if you're not taught it, you'll go out here what I'm seeing right now, because I've bought a lot of indie comics that I've read, and what happens is you get people who will take 7 pages to tell a story that could have been told in 3. You get people who will take 12 pages to tell a story that could have been told in 2. And that's because they think that they need to have all of these things in the page. But if you know how to sequence and make your page transition, you won't need to put all of the clutter your pages with so much details that basically do not move the story along. And this is something that, again, that is related to craft that's hurting superhero comics, because many of our more seasoned professionals have passed on, but they did not pass on their craft to the next generation. And this is why manga is beating comics, because manga, the artists are passing their craft on to the next person. And this is something that has to be done if you want to have good superhero comics. Now, it is possible to get good superhero comics, but the whole thing is it's going to require, again, trying to focus on rebuilding the structures that establish craft, having a good editorial with a strong vision, having an editorial that can teach about the craft of writing, having an editorial that can teach about the page and how pages work to artists, an editorial that keeps the characters consistent. That's what is lacking over as related to superhero comics. That's what's really lacking as related to the whole medium of superhero comics. There isn't anybody there to guide the ship. And because there's nobody there to guide the ship, this is why the comic book industry is crashing on the shores. This is something I believe Comics Matter, your boy Zach, talked about as related to the lack of leadership. And that shows as related to the products I'm seeing today. This is why everything isn't consistent, because there is no leadership. And again, if you want quality comics, you got to have quality editorial. And that's something that's lacking these days over at places like Marvel and DC, which really don't see a value in their comics outside of being material they can adapt and merchandise. But you can't have anything to adapt and merchandise if you don't have good stories. And sadly, I've seen a lot of good characters and good designs basically fall apart because editorial wouldn't do things like rein in a writer. Like when I looked at Christopher Cantwell's Iron Man, I mean, Alex Ross designed a fantastic retro modern armor, a great design that I think could have gone on for a good 15 to 20 years. But sadly, that whole design was done in by Christopher Cantwell's just absolutely terrible storytelling. And as a result, a great character design did not go over and become as popular as it could be. And again, that's what happens when you have bad editorial and grossly unqualified writers. This is what happens when you have a group of grossly unqualified people working on comics who have no passion and no heart for the material. They really go out here and produce material that hurts the overall brand. And as it hurts the overall brand of comics, it makes it where people don't want to read superhero comics. Again, superhero comics, they were the backbone of not only the comic shop, they were a major or an essential part of grocery stores, a major part of bookstores, a major part of supermarkets. They were the gateway to reading for many children of Generation X like myself. But what's happened is the people who are a part of superhero comics today, they really don't care about superheroes, and it shows on the pages of their comics. I mean, that's what's really wrong with superhero comics is we have editorial that goes through the motions. We have editorial that doesn't care. We have editorial that has no passion and heart, no love for the characters. And again, when people don't see love for the characters, they don't really have enough love in their heart to continue going on to buy a book. And again, if they don't care about the book, they don't want to buy the book. And this is the problem with superhero comics today. And that problem with superhero comics is we have no leadership and no direction, and we have dreary, depressing books. And again, if nobody wants to buy a dreary, depressing book, they want to buy a fun book that they can go out here and share and get us and smile and have some fun with. That's what people want in their comics, and that's what I try to do when I'm out here producing my own comics, like I did with John Haynes at Death's Door and Esteem No Good Deed. And I really want to go out here and produce more comics, and it's something I hope to do soon. It's just something that's just trying to get the funds together to do it. But I would love to go out here and do some more comics, because I know what's wrong with superhero comics, and I know it's something that can be fixed. But I understand it's a long process. But the whole thing is that we don't. I have the passion to do this, but the whole thing is I look at this industry, and again, I know what's wrong. And again, if you don't create characters that are fun, entertaining, and accessible, you're not going to get readers, and you're not going to be able to maintain these characters, and you won't be able to make these superhero movies, because if you don't have a foundation in good storytelling, then you're not going to be able to sell not only comics but merchandise as related to comics, and be able to go out here and have material to adapt. Now, I'm going to get ready to wrap up tonight's stream, and I want to thank everybody for coming out to tonight's stream. So, was one question I wanted to answer, and he said, what about Dark Horse and Image, I believe? Dark Horse makes some pretty good books. I like their Count Crowley, and Image makes a couple of good books here and there. There was a samurai book that I liked over at Image. I forget the name of it. I think it's Hattori. It's a really good samurai book. There are good comics out there, but the whole thing is, if we don't have superhero comics in line, it's hard for people to find all the other books like the indies. Again, everything with superhero comics, it has to be corrected if you want to have a full functioning comic book industry. So again, I'm going to get ready to wrap up tonight's stream. But before I get ready to wrap up tonight's stream, I'm asking everybody to check out my first comic with Bill Walko, Esteem No Good Deed. And you can check out Esteem No Good Deed for 99 cents. So you can get No Good Deed on Kindle for 99 cents. And you can also get my other comic, the John Haynes comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, on Lulu right now. So I'm asking everybody to just if you want to see how I write comics, these are two examples of how I write comics. And you can get a look at No Good Deed and John Haynes at Death's Door on both of those companies. You can get it at Lulu, and you can get it on Kindle, and you can sample how I write comics. Now, along with those comics, I have the books of the 2023 catalog, which are the John Haynes Godbreaker, John Haynes 1987, and Isis and Esteem books from last year. And again, you can get those books on Amazon.com as well. And I'm getting ready to go write another Isis series story. And you really want to pick up John Haynes' Dark Succubus, because that book is going to tie into the new Isis book for 2024. And you can get all my books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find all of my books at other online booksellers like Smashwords, the iBookstore, and Google Play. And if you were to help me out as related to making more videos, you can donate to the Cash App, and that helps me be able to make more videos and make more comics. All of the money that I get from Cash App and PayPal, I use to pay artists like Bill Walko to do covers like Isis Legacy and Esteem Horror of the Hyena Woman. And I also pay artists like Mike Williams to do covers for John Haynes Godbreaker and John Haynes 1987. And I pay artists like Antonio Baldari for books like to do the art on John Haynes at Death's Door. So every dollar you guys spend is spent on projects, and I am very transparent about the projects that I work on. So every dollar you guys donate to the Cash App or the PayPal is used on an SJS Direct project, or to pay for the internet and other expenses. So every dollar is used, again, out here for these services. And again, every dollar, I try to make most of the money, and I try to appreciate all of you for all of your support. And again, I thank you guys for spending time with me at tonight's stream, and I'm hoping you'll be here for next week's stream. Everybody have a good evening, and everybody have a good night.